So, towards the end of 2020, we were surprised by the Chinese recovery from the pandemic that put oil prices on a bullish trend. Then, after a small pullback, Delta variant was not able to derail that recovery, as the US economy added record jobs and proved that the Omicron variant would not be as damaging as people thought. However, this recovery came with inflationary concerns that threatened to become structural. Just about the same time that these things were happening, the war in Ukraine broke out, accelerating that upward trend in the energy sector, and predictably will do the same to the inflationary trend as well. The paradox of it all is that a barrel that cost over $100 mainly benefits the aggressor in this war. Yes, Vladimir Putin. So today, I want us to take a ride on the intense roller coaster that international oil prices have represented in the recent years and what it represents for the world's leading economy. Hi there, my name is Hector. If you're new to my channel, here I talk about everything related to personal finance, from stock market, real estate, cryptocurrencies, and even NFTs. So if that catches your attention, would you please consider subscribing and hitting that bell notification so you get an alert every time I post a new video. In the commodity market, few commodities are as volatile as energy, and few things the economy depends on as much as in energy. Energy even has the capacity to reconfigure the biggest manifestations of culture. Remember the sound of those big, fast, gas-hungry Camaros and Mustangs from the 60s and 70s? Well, the OPEC oil embargo in 1973 pushed the automobile industry and consumers to use smaller and more compact cars. Ever since those days, the psychological threshold of $100 per barrel has been a ghost that scares consumer countries. After the bull cycle of the early 2000s, for much of the past decade, the threat of an expensive barrel remained contained for the most part. But that has just changed, and the reasons are varied. They range from growing concerns of the way that we produce energy, seeking to reverse the effects on climate change, to the usual political interests. But why are we seeing oil prices well above $100? The original forecast just a few weeks ago was that oil would reach $100 per barrel by mid or late summer, with the WTI, the reference barrel of oil, at around $117 by that time according to the Bank of America forecast. But the WTI reached $100 just in February, and it went as high as $123 and is now, at the time of this recording, sitting at around $110 to $120 per barrel. Now, there are several reasons for this. The first and most obvious at the day is the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February. But prior to that regression, there was already an uptrend justifying that foresight, mainly driven by the green transition. And I know it sounds kind of absurd that a transition that seeks to make oil use part of history is at the same time a factor that makes it more expensive, but I will explain why later in this video. For now, let's focus on the most obvious one, which is the Ukraine factor. Let's use an example. On Thursday, February 24th, 3 days after the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the shares of Cheniere, the largest US exporter of natural gas, rose 7.6%. This was an effect of the indirect impact of Russian oil and gas, which everyone believed that would be affected by Western sanctions, which, as we know now, there actually were. But the point here is that all this happened even before any sanctions were applied to the energy sector. The impact becomes even more clear if we take into consideration that Russia supplies a tenth of world's oil production. As Russia becomes unable to bring its production to the market due to the blockades, or is unable to sustain and give maintenance to its facilities, the fragile preconditions will combine to send prices soaring. This is exactly what happened at the very moment when the first Russian missile hit the Ukrainian soil. Alright, but what about the pre-war uptrend? Because prices were already going up anyways. This happened due to a mix of low investment and low inventories. Earlier we said that contrary to what we would think, the green transition is actually a factor driving the prices of fossil energy up. This paradoxical behavior is happening because the transition is far from being complete. So this is the problem. Green energies are still more expensive overall than fossil energies, and moreover, they do not satisfy the large market demand. So even before the transition is complete, many oil and gas producers have decreased their investment in oil production, while at the same time moving their resources towards diversification to be able to weather the time ahead. So part of that production comes from declining fields where making a barrel of oil is more expensive. In addition, with lower production because of these diversification attempts, demand simply outstripped supply, driving prices higher because the leading economies simply cannot afford to wait for green energy to become cheap and reliable to run and perform at their best. Alright, but this investment because of the migration to green energies is not the only cause that makes it more expensive to produce oil. There are also other factors such as inflation that increase the cost of the barrel, and from there, straight to what you pay every time you fill up the tank. Yet another factor that makes oil more expensive is the production from fracking. As this process became less and less competitive, the barrels generated through this process ended up exiting the market. This results in lower reserves, which is exacerbated even more by the Saudi Arabia cut. It is kind of crazy to think that just 2 years ago, oil was at $0 per barrel. Yes, that is right. Do you remember on April 20th of 2020? US oil futures for the month of May dropped as low as zero due to decline in storage capacity. In those days, and with the world economy grinding to a halt, oil began to go into storage as it could not be sold. This avalanche of black gold quickly overwhelmed the storage capacity of refineries, pipelines, and even oil tankers. Thus, the paradox of producers having to pay for the oil they produced happened. In fact, the WTI barrel of oil fell below zero to trade at negative $37. The WTI then became the best indicator of uncertainty in those days, when nobody knew where the economy or when the economy was going to be reactivated. Some people even cast some apocalyptic predictions about that, saying that that was a sign of the end of the fossil energy era. But such predictions were just simply too premature. In fact, during the same day, futures already for the month of June of 2020 remained in a positive territory, and gains were even further increased by November. The trend was already outlined and became a reality in February of this year, with a barrel of oil surpassing the $100 barrier. At the core of this trend is the optimism of investors who assumed that the economy would rebound after the events of 2020. They also knew that the price below zero also had a speculative component unrelated to the health of the industry. They knew that those profiting from speculating in the market did everything possible to obtain storage to keep the gas waiting for the rebound. Do you remember those days? One of the most spectacular means they used to storage gas was the tank ships that they filled and then just parked by the sea waiting for prices to come back up. Because of this move, the rental of tanks or any facility that could be used to storage went through the roof. But when the economy rebounded, it proved to be a golden investment. But what no one could have ever foreseen was when or why oil would reach and then surpass pre-pandemic price levels. But yeah, it is the war in Ukraine what is driving the price of oil to pre-pandemic levels and even higher, a lot earlier than predicted. This brings me to the next point though, and that is that there was already a forecast that said that demand would reach 2019 levels that come from even earlier, before the war broke out. Although Russian troops had been already at the Ukraine border since December last year, it was uncertain which way Putin would go. But already in January, the Wall Street Journal picked up reports that said that the demand would reach pre-health crisis levels and would have impact on prices. In conjunction to that, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, estimates that this year's demand will be of 99.7 million barrels per day. That is 200,000 more than the world consumed back in 2019. One of the most important components of this behavior is the control of the virus. Back in 2020, when the price of oil dropped below zero, the expectation was that it was going to be a long period of time before any significant or effective health response against the pandemic was created. but science achieved what seemed impossible. Then, with the first variant of the virus, the sentiment of the market was that everything was going to start all over again. Delta briefly set the economy back, and so the expectation was that Omicron would be even worse. Fortunately, this was not the case, and the relatively harmless effects of this variant reaffirmed the analysis that the economy would not suffer another downturn. The problem with that though is that now we were significantly lower in supply compared to demand, and higher demand with less supply equals higher prices. So this is the question. How does $100 plus barrel of oil affect the US economy? President Joe Biden warned that even without sending US troops, some of the consequences of the war in Ukraine would be painful to this economy. He had in mind that the increase in the price of energy, it's a direct impact to the high inflation that we were already suffering. This impact translates directly to the cost of oil at the pump. Today, gas at the pump is twice as expensive as it was before the pandemic began. This rise in prices comes at a time when the country, despite its record employment figures, has not fully recovered from the recession caused by the pandemic. And if there is something that the average American voter hates, it's having to pay more money when they fill up their tank. So if President Biden's approval ratings were low before the surge, they would probably be even worse after a few weeks. Also, we have to remember that all of this is happening in the middle of an election year, making it an argument in favor of the Republican opposition to win control of the Congress in November. And although this is a political consequence of the fuel hike, it also has an economic effect, because initiatives like the Build Back Better Green would probably end up being buried. So, at least for the short term, the only strategy under the US control to lower the prices of oil is to open the tap to sell a few million barrels of their own reserve, because the prospect of major producers increasing their supply has already been denied by most of the important ones, at least. For example, the Wall Street Journal reports that Saudi Arabia is unwilling to increase their supply. This country alone has the capacity to drive prices down if they want it, because currently it's only pumping 10 million barrels out of 12 million that they could. In fact, they don't even have to pump immediately. It only needs to show some willingness to do so to affect the market. But Saudi Arabia has snubbed the US and plans to stick to the 5-year alliance that they signed with Russia. This alliance, which does not contemplate any significant increase in pumping, was signed last year among the members of the so-called OPEC Plus. This agreement only allows an increase of 400,000 barrels per day to maintain market stability, which at this time is way insufficient. The situation is even worse because Saudi Arabia doesn't even comply with this additional pumping. According to them, any renegotiation of production with member countries would not bring stability but volatility. The calls from the White House have resonated not only in rating but also in the offices of all the Gulf producers. However, in all of them, the response was similar. None of them wants to make the mistake of pumping more production prematurely and thus depress the market in what could be the last spectacular price hike in history before the Great Green Transition. The truth is that the US impact will be a lot broader, as we have mentioned. And not only will the US suffer for more expensive energy, Europe will also fall into that inflationary spiral. The truth of the matter is that 100 plus barrel of oil doesn't only affect the United States, but the global economy. And it does it at a time when the post-pandemic recovery has not yet been consolidated. And this, without a doubt, will have consequences. Some are foreseeable, such as the impact in countries that cannot afford to pay for their energy bill. But in addition, expensive energy will also bring unexpected consequences. For example, it could also accelerate the automobile industry shift to electric. And finally, expensive oil could sound like political instability, as countries face the discontent of their citizens, fed up of paying high prices at the gas pump. And man, instability is the last thing the world needs at this moment. Alright, so this is it for today. It was a long one, guys, and it was also a long one to put together. So if you appreciate the content and the effort put into this video, would you do me a favor and hit that like button for the YouTube algorithm? It would help my channel to grow and get my content to other people just like you. Also consider subscribing and hitting that bell notification so you get an alert every time I post a new video. Alright, I'll see you when I'll see you. Bye.